Alright, next is temperature sensor testing. Sensors TW and T1 are thermistors. They are thermally sensitive resistors made out of a ceramic-like semiconductor. Since both sensors function in the same way, testing and specifications are the same. The computer shows a temperature sensor failure for TW as LEDs 2-1W lighted, and for T1, LEDs 2-0W lighted. If there is an open or shorted wire in the circuit, the ECU display will also light up. Put the sensor in water that is 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Measure the resistance of the sensor. The reading should be between 2 and 3 kiloohms resistance. Now heat the water to 80 degrees Celsius or 176 degrees Fahrenheit and measure the resistance. The reading should now be between 0.2 and 0.4 kiloohms. Well, that's all there is to temperature sensor testing. First, check the ECU display, then measure the resistance at 20 degrees Celsius, and finally measure the resistance at 80 degrees Celsius. If the resistance is out of spec, replace the sensor. Now let's look at fuel system testing. There are 5 tests to perform: fuel system operation, fuel system pressure, pressure regulator, fuel pump, and fuel injector testing. A couple of warnings when working on the fuel system. Gasoline is highly volatile. Use common sense and don't smoke or have an open flame near your work area. The turbo's fuel system is pressurized, so always wear safety goggles. To test for fuel system operation, lightly squeeze the return line and turn the ignition on at the same time. You should hear a slight noise for the first 3 seconds, and the fuel line should pulse lightly. To test fuel system pressure, make sure the key is off. Then wrap a shop towel around the fuel line just below the banjo bolt. Loosen the check bolt just enough to let the fuel pressure bleed off. With the pressure released, remove the check bolt and attach the fuel pressure gauge. Make sure the gauge fitting is tightened against the banjo bolt. Now turn the key on. Do not start the engine. Measure the fuel pressure. It should be between 2.4 to 2.7 kilograms per square centimeter. That's between 34 and 38 pounds per square inch. Now start the engine and let it idle. The pressure reading should be between 2 to 2.4 kilograms per square centimeter, or between 28.4 and 34 psi. Now if the system doesn't meet these specs, you'll have to test the pressure regulator and fuel pump. To test the pressure regulator, remove the return fuel line from the fuel valve. Next, attach a length of fuel line to the valve and clamp it shut. Now open the fuel valve and hold a beaker under the return fuel line. Turn the key on. Fuel should pour into the beaker for 3 seconds. The setup for fuel pump testing is the same as the previous test. Put the transmission into gear and turn the key on. Have a large graduated beaker in place. Push the starter. The pump will run, and it should deliver at least 0.6 to 1.5 liters of fuel within 1 minute. Replace the pump if it does not meet specification. Recheck the fuel system pressure anytime the fuel pump or regulator is replaced. And replace the check bolt washer every time you loosen the banjo bolt check plug. Failure to replace the washer could result in a fuel leak. Don't overlook it. If you suspect a faulty injector, check the ECU display. To test a fuel injector, disconnect the good injector coupler. Turn on the key, quickly twist the throttle, and listen for a slight clicking sound at the test injector. If the injector doesn't click, you'll first test for voltage to the injector coupler. Connect a voltmeter to the injector coupler and turn the key on. There should be battery voltage available after 3 seconds. If voltage is not available at the coupler, check for voltage to the coupler from the battery through the main relay. If voltage is not present after the relay, but is available before the relay, replace the main relay. If there is voltage at the coupler, you'll next check the input voltage to the ECU coupler between terminals number 1 and 2. If there is no voltage here, test the main harness to the battery and repair as needed. If the injectors are getting voltage, measure the resistance through the injector. With the ignition switch off, proper resistance is between 1 and 3 ohms. Any other reading means that you'll have to replace the injector. Once again, for fuel injector testing, check the ECU display. Perform the one-shot click test. Check for voltage at the coupler and relay, and check resistance. If resistance and voltage are okay, replace the injector and retest. If there is still no click, replace the ECU and retest. Okay, that's it for the fuel system. Let's look at timing. For checking the ignition timing, there are 4 tests. First, check the timing at idle, then at 2,000 to 2,500 RPM advanced. After that, check the timing at 2,000 to 2,500 RPM with vacuum and pressure applied to the PIGN sensor. Before the timing can be tested, you'll have to paint the F1 and advance marks on the flywheel. Then paint the inside of the inspection cap matte black to reduce reflection. Next, warm up the engine, turn it off, and replace the timing hole cap with the inspection window. Now, hook up the strobe light and start the engine. Let it idle at 1,100 RPM and check the timing. The F1 mark should line up with the index mark. Now run the engine at 2,000 to 2,500 RPM. The timing advance marks should line up as you see here. Turn off the engine and hook up a vacuum pump to the PIGN sensor. Make sure to clamp off the PIGN sensor tube from the engine. Start the engine and adjust engine speed in a range between 2,000 and 2,500 RPM using the idle set screw. At 2,000 to 2,500 RPM, without vacuum applied, the F1 mark should be at the bottom of the inspection window. Apply 10 to 20 centimeters of mercury of vacuum, and the advance mark should line up with the index mark. Next, turn off the engine and connect a pressure pump to the PIGN sensor. Start the engine and run it at 2,000 to 2,500 RPM. Apply 5.9 to 9.7 psi to the PIGN. The F1 mark should line up with the index mark. If the timing does not advance or retard to specification, then test the PIGN sensor, sensor tubing, and pressure pickup. If they are within spec, then replace the ignition control unit and retest. Once again, the 4 tests for ignition timing are at idle, at 2,000 to 2,500 RPM with advance, at 2,000 to 2,500 RPM with applied vacuum, and at 2,000 to 2,500 RPM with applied pressure.